You said it was just dinner. Tae-hyun's voice cut through the dark mansion like a blade. Aliyah froze at the door, heels still in her hand, lipstick smudged, laughter still caught in her throat. 2 a.m. The chandelier above him wasn't even on. He'd been sitting in the dark, waiting.
It was...
Dinner doesn't last 8 hours.
She met his eyes, the eyes of a man who controlled an empire with a single word, and still she didn't flinch. Nia ordered dessert. Tae-hyun rose from the chair slowly, every movement precise, controlled.
Do you think this is a game?
No, I think you are just jealous.
For the first time since their marriage began, Kang Tae-hyun, the man who swore he would never let his heart enter this arrangement, had no answer. Because she was right, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Before we go further, do you think Tae-hyun is angry because Aliyah broke a rule, or because some part of him is scared he's losing her? Drop your theory below and stay close. This story is just getting started. No one in Seoul's underworld dared to ask Kang Tae-hyun why he married the way he did. They only knew the surface, a contract, a merger of two powerful families, a woman named Aliyah brought into his world not by choice but by his father's final wish before cancer took him. What they didn't know was simpler and far more dangerous. Tae-hyun had never once touched his wife's hand without purpose, never once looked at her the way men look at women they love. He gave her a mansion, bodyguards, a black card with no limit, and silence. Aliyah gave him something he never asked for: hope. She believed from the very first night she saw him standing in that church in a tailored black suit that this marriage could become something real. She believed it through the first month of empty dinners. She believed it through the first year of locked doors between their bedrooms. But belief has a shelf life, and somewhere between his silence and her patience, a single question began to grow, quiet and dangerous as a blade left in the dark. What is Tae-hyun really protecting himself from? Because it isn't power, it isn't his enemies, it isn't even his father's legacy. It's her. The men who worked under him whispered that Kang Tae-hyun had ice where his heart should be. His own bodyguards joked quietly that he'd sooner negotiate with a rival cartel than sit through a conversation about his own feelings. Aliyah heard the whispers too. She smiled through them because the alternative was admitting how much they stung. And by the time Tae-hyun understands what he's actually protecting himself from, it may already be too late to stop what's coming. 3 years earlier, the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. Tae-hyun was 26 the night his father called him to his bedside, tubes running into arms that once ruled half of Seoul's underground economy without ever raising a voice. The old man's grip was still iron, even as his body failed him. "You will marry her," his father said. No apology, no softness, just an order. The same way he'd given every order of Tae-hyun's life. Who? Aliyah Bangkole. Her father owes me a debt older than you. This settles it. Tae-hyun didn't argue. He never argued. Arguing was for men who believed their opinions mattered more than duty, and his father had spent 26 years teaching him that duty was the only thing that mattered. "Do you love her?" Tae-hyun asked, though he already suspected the answer. His father's eyes, dimmed by morphine, still managed to sharpen. Love is not a requirement of this family. Loyalty is, discipline is. Protect her, provide for her, that is enough. Tae-hyun nodded, because that was what he'd always done. Nodded and carried the weight without complaint. By the following spring, the wedding took place in a private chapel outside the city, attended by men in dark suits who bowed instead of smiling. Aliyah walked down that aisle in white lace, her heart hammering with something dangerously close to joy. She didn't know this man. She'd met him twice before the ceremony, both times for less than 20 minutes. But when their eyes met at the altar, something in her chest simply decided, this is it. This is the beginning of my forever. She had no idea she was marrying a wall.
A few weeks into the marriage, Aliyah learned her husband's schedule better than she knew her own reflection. He left before sunrise, his driver already waiting at the gate. He returned after 10 most nights, sometimes later, his tie already loosened, his expression unreadable, like a man carrying the weight of an entire city on his shoulders and refusing to set any of it down. Dinner was served for 2, but eaten alone more often than not, her plate growing cold across from his empty chair. She'd sit there some nights, just watching the steam rise and fade from his untouched food, wondering what kind of life she'd walked into. She tried, in the beginning. She learned to cook the dishes his mother used to make, information she gathered carefully from the house staff who flinched any time her name came up, their eyes darting away like the subject itself was forbidden. She waited by the window some nights just to watch his car pull into the gates, cataloging the exact moment his shoulders would tense before he stepped inside, bracing himself for a home he didn't seem to want. He always thanked her for dinner, politely, distantly, like she was staff he respected, not a wife he wanted. By the 3rd month, Aliyah stopped setting a place for him at the table. Naya noticed the change before anyone else did. She'd been Aliyah's best friend since university, the kind of friend who could read a mood from across a room and already have a plan to fix it before you finished explaining. When she showed up at the mansion gates one afternoon, arms full of takeout containers and 0 patience for the guards checking her bag, she found Aliyah curled into the corner of an obscenely expensive couch, staring at nothing. "Okay," Naya said, dropping the bags on the marble counter with a loud clatter. "We are not doing this today." "Doing what?" "This!" Naya gestured at all of her, the silk robe, the untouched tea, the hollow look in her best friend's eyes. "You did not survive 4 years of engineering school, 3 brutal internships, and my terrible taste in men to become a sad ghost in a mansion the size of an airport." Aliyah almost smiled. Almost. "He's not cruel, Naya. He's just not here, even when he's here." Naya sat beside her, softer now, pulling one of Aliyah's hands into her own. "Does he know you're unhappy?" "I don't think he'd notice if I left." Naya's jaw tightened at that, protective in the way only a decade of friendship could make someone. "Then maybe it's time he starts noticing something." That night, something in Aliyah quietly closed. Not her love for him, that was stubborn, buried deep, refusing to fully die no matter how many cold dinners she sat through alone, but her waiting, her hoping, the version of herself that used to save the good stories for dinner conversations that never came, the version that used to lie awake listening for his footsteps in the hallway. She decided somewhere in the dark of that enormous, lonely bedroom, staring up to a ceiling too high and too empty, that she would stop shrinking herself around a man who barely looked up. If he wanted silence, he could have it, but she was done offering him her joy on a platter he never touched. The following week, Aliyah started living. She said yes to Naya's dinner invitation without checking her husband's schedule first, without leaving a note explaining herself, without the small guilty flutter that used to accompany doing anything for herself. She wore the red dress that had been sitting in her closet with the tag still on it, a birthday gift from Naya that she'd never had the courage or the occasion to wear. She laughed loudly, freely, at a table of Naya's chaotic, wonderful friends, people who asked about her opinions and actually waited for the answers. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like herself again, not Mrs. Kang, not a debt repaid, just Aliyah. She came home at midnight. Tae-hyun was already asleep, or pretending to be. Either way, he didn't ask where she'd been. It stung more than she expected, but it also confirmed something she'd suspected for months. He wasn't watching, he didn't care, so she stopped waiting for permission to be happy. What Aliyah didn't know was that Tae-hyun noticed everything. He noticed the empty dinner plate first, the one that used to be set for him by habit, then stopped appearing altogether, a small absence that felt louder than any argument. He noticed the new perfume in the hallway, floral and warm, nothing like the quiet vanilla scent she used to wear, the one he'd never admitted to liking.
He noticed the sound of her laughter drifting behind closed doors during phone calls with Nia, a sound he realized with quiet unease he'd never actually heard directed at him. He told himself it didn't matter. He had an empire to run, enemies circling his territory like sharks scenting blood, aboard of ruthless men waiting for any sign of weakness they could exploit. He didn't have room for a wife who wanted more than he'd built himself to give. But by the following month, denial started cracking under the weight of small, unbearable details. Aliyah stopped asking what time he'd be home. Aliyah stopped texting him during the day, the little updates he used to ignore and secretly, quietly look forward to. Aliyah started getting home late, 11 p.m., then midnight, then later, always smelling like someone else's night out, always glowing in a way that had nothing to do with him. And Tae-hyun, a man who had never once felt threatened by rival gangs, rival families, or men with guns pointed at his chest, found himself unsettled by his own wife's happiness. He hated how much it bothered him. He hated it more that he couldn't explain why. One evening he came home early, a rare occurrence, rare enough that even his driver looked mildly surprised by the request. Instead, he found an empty mansion, no dinner smell drifting from the kitchen, no sound of her humming to herself upstairs while she got ready for bed, just silence and a note on the counter in her handwriting. Out with Nia, don't wait up. Tae-hyun read it twice, jaw tightening in a way he didn't fully understand. Don't wait up, as if he ever had. He told himself it was nothing. He poured a drink he didn't finish and sat in his study pretending to review shipment documents he couldn't focus on, his eyes drifting to the clock every few minutes despite himself, despite every instinct telling him to stop. By 10 p.m., she still wasn't home. By midnight, he'd stopped pretending to work. His phone buzzed once, a message from one of his men stationed near the restaurant district, a routine security check he'd requested without quite admitting to himself why. Mrs. Kang left the restaurant 2 hours ago, not heading home, currently at Neon Room Karaoke Lounge. Tae-hyun stared at the message for a long moment, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. A restaurant dinner that ended 2 hours ago, and she still wasn't home. Something in his chest, something he refused to name, pulled tight, sharp, and unfamiliar, like a warning he didn't have the vocabulary to translate. He told himself he wasn't worried. He told himself he wasn't jealous. He told himself a lot of things that night, sitting alone in the dark, waiting for the sound of the front door, counting the minutes like a man keeping watch over something he was terrified to admit he wanted to protect. At 2 a.m., headlights swept across the driveway. Tae-hyun didn't move from the chair by the window. He listened to the front door open, to the soft, uneven rhythm of heels against marble, to Aliyah's quiet laughter fading into a hum as she made her way toward the stairs, completely unaware that her husband was sitting in the dark, waiting. "You said it was just dinner," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Aliyah froze at the base of the stairs, heels still in her hand, lipstick smudged, laughter still caught in her throat. She turned slowly, steadying herself against the railing, and found him sitting there, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and furious in a way she'd never seen him before. "It was," she said, Dinner doesn't last 8 hours. He met her eyes, chin lifting despite the nerves suddenly tightening in her stomach. Nia ordered dessert. Tae-hyun rose from the chair slowly, every movement precise, controlled, the calm of a man who had spent his entire life being told that emotion was a weakness he could not afford to afford. "Do you think this is a game?" Aliyah stepped closer instead of retreating, something reckless and honest rising in her chest after months of swallowing her own feelings. "No," she said, "I think you're jealous." The words landed like a slap neither of them expected. For the first time since the day they married, Kang Tae-hyun, the man who swore he would never let his heart enter this arrangement, had no answer, because she was right, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had.
Neither of them moved for a long moment after the words left her mouth. "I think you're jealous." Aliyah watched something pass behind Tae-hyun's eyes. Not quite anger, not quite denial. Something closer to a man realizing the ground beneath him had quietly rearranged itself while he wasn't paying attention. He recovered fast, he always did. "Go to bed, Aliyah." "That's it? No apology for waiting up like some kind of warden?" "I don't owe you an apology for being concerned about my wife's safety." Concerned. She let the words sit in the air between them, heavy with everything he wasn't saying. "Is that what we're calling it now?" He didn't answer. He never answered the questions that mattered. Aliyah climbed the stairs alone, her heels dangling from 2 fingers, leaving him standing in the dark exactly where she'd found him. The next morning, the house staff moved carefully around both of them, sensing the shift in temperature even before either spoke a word. Aliyah ate breakfast in silence. Tae-hyun left for the office earlier than usual, his jaw set, his coffee untouched. Neither mentioned the night before, but something had changed, and both of them knew it. By the following week, Tae-hyun had made a decision he wasn't proud of. He told himself it was about security. Threats from the Choi syndicate were escalating, a warehouse fire that looked deliberately set, a warning message left at one of his shipping docks. It was reasonable, he reasoned, to tighten protective measures around his wife during a period of heightened risk. It was less reasonable that the protective measures included 2 additional bodyguards assigned specifically to accompany Aliyah anywhere she went, including dinners with Naya. Aliyah discovered the new arrangement when she tried to leave for a simple coffee run and found 2 men in dark suits already waiting by the car. "What is this?" "Mr. Kong's orders, ma'am," the taller one said, not unkindly. "For your protection." Aliyah's temper, usually so carefully managed, snapped clean through. She found Tae-hyun in his study that evening, files spread across his desk, glasses perched low on his nose, a detail she'd never actually seen before, oddly human against the cold efficiency of the room. "You put bodyguards on me." He didn't look up. "There are threats against the family right now. It's a precaution. It's control. It's safety. I have been going to dinner with my best friend for the last 6 months without incident, Tae-hyun. This isn't about safety. It's about you not liking that I stopped waiting around for you." That got his attention. He looked up slowly, something flickering across his expression that he quickly smoothed away. "You think I did this out of jealousy. I know you did. You're wrong. Then remove them." A long silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "I can't do that. Not until the situation with Choi is resolved." Aliyah studied him for a moment, searching for the lie in his composure and finding none, which somehow made it worse. He genuinely believed his own explanation. He genuinely didn't understand that control and protection had started to look identical to him, the way his father probably taught him they were the same thing. "Fine," she said quietly. "Keep your guards, but don't expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is." She left him standing alone in his study, the weight of her words settling somewhere he didn't have a name for. Over the next several days, Aliyah adjusted to her new shadows with a kind of stubborn grace that both irritated and impressed the two men assigned to her. She took them to pottery class, where they stood awkwardly in the corner while she got clay under her fingernails. She dragged them to Naya's book club meeting, where Naya introduced them to the entire group as Aliyah's emotional support security detail, a joke that made even the more stoic of the two crack a smile. "Your husband is a very serious man," the shorter guard, whose name she had learned was Sang-woo, commented one evening as they waited outside a restaurant. "You have no idea," Aliyah said. "He mentioned you 3 times in this morning's briefing, unrelated to security matters." Aliyah paused, something warm and unwelcome stirring in her chest. What did he say? Sang-woo suddenly seemed to remember his job description and said nothing further.
Naya, predictably, found the entire situation hilarious. "He assigned you a security detail because he's in love with you and doesn't know how to say it," she declared over dinner one night, loud enough that Sang-woo, stationed a respectful distance away, visibly tensed. "He's not in love with me, Naya. He's controlling." Baby, those are not mutually exclusive things for a man like that. Have you met his family? Men like Tae-hyun were raised believing love and control are the same language. Aliyah stirred her drink, unwilling to admit how much that observation resonated. "Even if you're right, it doesn't matter. He'll never say it. He barely admits jealousy when I hand it to him on a plate." "Then stop waiting for him to say it," Naya said, echoing the advice she'd given weeks earlier, the one that had started this whole shift. "Make him show it instead." The following Friday, Naya had an idea. "Karaoke," she announced, bursting into Aliyah's dressing room without knocking, as usual. "Neon room, tonight, no excuses." "I have guards now, Naya. It's not exactly a covert operation anymore." "Good. Let them come. Let them report back every detail. Let your husband hear exactly how much fun your wife is having without him." There was something reckless and satisfying about the plan that Aliyah couldn't quite talk herself out of. By 9 p.m., Neon Room was already loud, dark, and glittering with cheap disco lights that somehow made everything feel more alive. Aliyah and Naya claimed a private booth near the back, ordered a round of drinks neither of them needed, and within an hour had worked their way through half the karaoke catalog with increasing volume and decreasing skill. Sang-woo and the other guards stood near the entrance, doing their best to look unbothered by the chaos unfolding a few feet away. "Your turn," Naya announced, shoving the microphone into Aliyah's hands as the opening notes of a painfully sentimental love ballad began to play. "I don't even know this song." "Doesn't matter. Feel it." Aliyah, 3 drinks deep and past the point of caring how she sounded, launched into the song with theatrical, off-key passion, belting lyrics about longing and heartbreak, while Naya dissolved into laughter in the booth behind her. She had no idea her husband was standing in the doorway. Tae-hyun had told himself he was simply checking on security arrangements. That was the story he'd repeated in his head the entire drive over, after Sang-woo's update mentioned the karaoke lounge, after some restless, illogical urge pulled him out of his study and into his car, despite 3 unread reports still waiting on his desk.
He told himself he wasn't jealous. He told himself he wasn't curious. He told himself a lot of things on the drive over, none of which survived the moment he stepped through the door and saw her. Aliyah stood on a small raised platform near the booths, microphone in hand, singing with an enthusiasm that had absolutely nothing to do with talent and everything to do with joy. Her hair had come loose from its careful style, her laughter kept breaking through the lyrics, and the song, the ridiculous, sentimental love song she'd chosen without even realizing it, carried lyrics that sounded, in that dim lounge light, disturbingly close to a confession. Something about a man who never says what he means, something about waiting for someone who never shows they care, something about wanting to be seen. Tae-hyun stood frozen near the entrance, utterly unprepared for what he was witnessing. His terrifying, controlled, always composed wife, drunk, glowing, singing a love song with her best friend cheering her on, and somehow, despite the absurdity of the scene, it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in 3 years of marriage. Naya spotted him first. "Well, well," she said, loud enough to be heard over the music, nudging Aliyah's arm. "Look who decided to join us." Aliyah turned, microphone still in hand, and found her husband standing there in his dark suit, utterly out of place among the neon lights and cheap disco balls, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decode. The song ended. The room, briefly, felt very quiet, despite the noise around them. "You followed me," she said, setting the microphone down. "I was checking on security. You were jealous." He didn't argue this time.
Nia, sensing exactly what kind of moment this was, grabbed her drink and announced with theatrical subtlety that she needed to go find the bathroom, dragging both guards along with some excuse about needing an escort, leaving Aliyah and Tae-hyun alone near the edge of the small stage. "You didn't have to come," Aliyah said, some of her earlier boldness giving way to something quieter, more uncertain now that he was actually standing in front of her. "I know." "Then why did you—" Tae-hyun was quiet for a long moment, and Aliyah watched him search for words that clearly didn't come easily to him, words that felt foreign in a mouth trained for negotiation and command, not honesty. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about where you were," he finally admitted, "and I hated that I couldn't stop." It wasn't a declaration of love, it wasn't even close, but for a man who had spent 3 years giving her nothing but silence, it felt like an earthquake. "You know," Aliyah said, stepping closer, emboldened by the drinks and the strange vulnerability in his voice, "for a man who claims not to care, you drove across the city at 11 at night to watch me sing badly in a karaoke bar. You weren't bad. I was terrible, and you know it." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close, closer than she'd ever seen from him. "You were terrible," he agreed, "but I couldn't look away." Something shifted in the space between them, the air suddenly thick with 3 years of unspoken things finally pressing toward the surface. "Tae-hyun." His name in her mouth sounded different than usual, softer, less like a formality and more like an invitation. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I've given you nothing to work with. I know you deserve more than silence and empty dinners. I don't know how to be anything other than what my father made me." "I don't need you to be him," Aliyah said. "I just need you to be honest with me." "I am jealous," he said, the confession dragged out of him like a splinter finally removed. "I've been jealous for weeks, watching you laugh at things I'm not part of, watching you glow in ways you never do around me. I told myself it was about security, about control, about protecting what's mine, but it was never that. What was it then? I didn't want to lose you before I ever really had you."
The space between them closed slowly, deliberately, both of them aware of exactly what was happening and neither willing to stop it. Aliyah could feel her heartbeat in her throat, 3 years of hoping and waiting collapsing into a single suspended moment. Tae-hyun reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the man who commanded fear in every room he entered. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "Then let me help you." She closed the last of the distance herself, and when their lips finally met, it wasn't hesitant or careful. It was 3 years of silence, breaking apart at once, everything neither of them had said, finally finding a different kind of language. The kiss was slow at first, almost disbelieving, like both of them expected the moment to shatter the second either pulled away. But it deepened as Tae-hyun's hand slid to the small of her back, drawing her closer, and Aliyah felt something in him finally truly let go. The discipline, the control, the wall he'd spent his whole life constructing, all of it dissolving into the warmth of her mouth against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tae-hyun rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, as though he needed a moment to process what had just happened. That, he said quietly, was not part of the security check. Aliyah laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and for the first time since her wedding day, she believed, fully and without doubt, that this marriage might actually become the forever she'd hoped for. But hope, as Aliyah would soon learn, always comes with a price. Because somewhere across the city, in an office far less glamorous than the one Tae-hyun occupied, a man loyal to the Choi syndicate was reviewing surveillance photos of Kang Tae-hyun's wife, her routines, her favorite karaoke bar, her best friend, her new bodyguards. And in the world Tae-hyun had built, nothing his enemies noticed ever stayed harmless for long. By the following Monday, the warmth from the karaoke lounge had settled into something quieter, steadier, not a fairy tale transformation, but a shift neither of them wanted to name too loudly for fear of scaring it away. Tae-hyun started coming home earlier, not every night, not perfectly, but enough that Aliyah noticed the dinner plate across from her stayed warm more often than it went cold. He still struggled with words. Some evenings he sat through entire meals saying almost nothing, but his eyes followed her in a way they never had before, attentive, in the quiet, careful manner of a man relearning a language he'd forgotten how to speak. "You're staring," Aliyah said one evening, not looking up from her plate. "I'm observing." That's the same thing with better vocabulary. The corner of his mouth twitched, that small, rare, almost smile she'd started collecting like currency. "Fine, I'm staring." But even as something soft was growing between them, the world outside the mansion walls was tightening. Min Jun's reports grew more frequent, more urgent. The Choi syndicate had moved from testing boundaries to something more deliberate. A shipment intercepted, a business partner suddenly unreachable, whispers among Tae-hyun's own men that the Chois were building towards something larger than territory disputes. "They know about her," Min Jun said quietly during a private briefing, sliding a folder across Tae-hyun's desk. Inside were surveillance photographs, Aliyah at the karaoke lounge, Aliyah at pottery class, Aliyah laughing with Nia on a street corner, all taken from a careful distance by someone who clearly wanted to remain unseen. Tae-hyun's expression didn't change, but something in his posture went rigid, controlled fury barely contained beneath the surface. "How long have they had these?" "At least 2 weeks. And you're only bringing this to me now? I wanted to be certain before I alarmed you, sir." Tae-hyun closed the folder slowly, his jaw tight. "Double her security, effective immediately, and find out who took these photographs." That evening, Tae-hyun found Aliyah in the garden, sitting on the stone bench she'd claimed as her favorite spot in the entire estate, a book open in her lap that she wasn't actually reading. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made her set the book aside immediately. He told her everything: the surveillance, the increased threat, the Choi syndicate's growing interest in her as a potential vulnerability to exploit. He watched her carefully as he spoke, bracing for panic, for anger, for the kind of fear that would make her regret ever stepping into his world. Instead, Aliyah simply asked, "What do you need me to do?" The question caught him off guard. Not, "Why is this happening to me?" Not, "How could you let this happen?" Just a straightforward willingness to face whatever came next, together. "I need you to trust the security measures, even when they feel excessive. I need you to tell me if anything feels wrong, no matter how small." "Okay." "That's it? No argument?" Aliyah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I married into this world, Tae-hyun. I didn't understand what that meant at first, but I do now. I'm not going anywhere." Something in his chest loosened at her words, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying until it began, slowly, to ease. Over the following days, Aliyah's world grew smaller by necessity. Fewer outings, more guards, careful routes planned in advance by Min-jun's team. She hated the restriction, but she understood it now in a way she hadn't before, watching Tae-hyun's exhaustion deepen with each new report, each sleepless night spent coordinating countermeasures against a threat that refused to show its full hand. She started staying up with him some nights, bringing tea to his study, sitting quietly across from him while he worked, not to be useful exactly, just to be present. He never asked her to leave. "You don't have to sit here," he told her one night, not looking up from his papers. "I know. You could be sleeping." "I could be. I'm choosing not to." He looked up then, something warm and slightly bewildered in his expression, as though he still hadn't fully adjusted to the idea that someone might choose to be near him simply because they wanted to, not because duty required it. It was on one of those late nights, somewhere past midnight, papers scattered across his desk and both of them running on too little sleep, that Aliyah finally asked the question she'd been carrying since the beginning of their marriage. "Tae-hyun, why does it scare you so much, loving someone?" He went very still, the way he always did when a conversation edged too close to something he'd spent his whole life avoiding.
For a moment, she thought he might deflect the way he always had, might retreat back behind the wall he was only just beginning to lower. Instead, he set down his pen. "My parents' marriage was arranged, the same as ours," he said slowly, choosing each word with visible care. "But unlike us, they never found their way to anything more than duty. My father believed love was a distraction, a weakness that made men vulnerable to their enemies. He raised me the same way his father raised him. Discipline first, always. Obedience, control. Love was never part of the curriculum." "What about your mother?" Something in his expression shifted, softened, grief and tenderness intertwining in a way Aliyah had never seen from him before. "My mother loved him," he said quietly, "despite everything, despite the coldness, despite the distance, despite 30 years of a marriage that gave her almost nothing back. She used to say that love wasn't about what you received, it was about what you chose to give, even when it wasn't returned." "That sounds lonely." It was. I watched her spend her whole life loving a man who couldn't love her back, at least not in any way she could recognize. I used to think that was just what marriage was, duty wearing the mask of devotion. He paused, and Aliyah watched him gather himself for whatever came next, the way a man braces before stepping into cold water.
She got sick when I was 22. Cancer. It moved fast, faster than any of the doctors expected. My father visited her every day in the hospital, brought her flowers, sat with her for exactly 1 hour each evening like it was scheduled into his calendar. He never once told her he loved her, not once, not even at the end. Aliyah reached across the desk, covering his hand with hers. He didn't pull away. The night before she died, Tae-hyun continued, his voice quieter now, more fragile than she'd ever heard it before. She asked me to sit with her. She was so weak by then, barely able to hold a conversation, but she held my hand and told me something I've carried with me ever since. What did she say? She said, "Don't let your father's silence become your inheritance. You are allowed to love Tae-hyun. You are allowed to be loved. Don't build the same walls he built. They will only leave you as alone as he left me." His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Aliyah watched a man who commanded fear in every room he entered look for just a moment like the grieving 22-year-old boy he'd once been. "I buried that conversation for years," he admitted. "It was easier to become what my father made me than to risk becoming what she asked me to be. Love felt like a door that only led to loss. I watched her love a man for 30 years and receive almost nothing in return. I told myself I would never make that mistake. I would never let anyone close enough to leave that kind of absence behind." And now? He finally looked up, meeting her eyes with a vulnerability that stripped away every ounce of the controlled, untouchable man the world believed him to be. "Now I look at you, and I understand for the first time what she was trying to tell me. That the wall I'd built to protect myself from becoming my father was never actually protecting me from anything. It was just making sure I became exactly what she warned me not to." Aliyah rose from her chair and moved around the desk, kneeling beside him so their eyes were level, so there was nothing between them but honesty. "I thank you for telling me," she said softly. "I should have told you years ago. You told me when you were ready. That matters more than when." He reached up, cupping her face gently, his thumb brushing along her cheekbone with a tenderness that felt entirely new, entirely unguarded. "I don't want to become my father. I don't want you to spend 30 years loving a man who never learns to say it back." "Then don't. It's not that simple. I don't know how to unlearn 26 years of discipline in a single conversation." "You don't have to unlearn it all at once. You just have to keep choosing me one honest moment at a time, like tonight." Something in his expression cracked open completely, every careful wall he'd spent his whole life constructing giving way at once. "I love you," he said, the words visibly costing him something, dragged up from a place he'd kept sealed since the night his mother died. "I think I have for longer than I've let myself admit. I was just too afraid to say it."
Aliyah felt her eyes fill with tears she didn't try to hide. "Say it again." "I love you, Aliyah." She closed the distance between them and kissed him, slower this time than the first, deeper, carrying none of the frantic uncertainty of the karaoke lounge and all of the quiet, hard-won honesty of everything he'd just given her. His hands framed her face like she was something precious he'd only just allowed himself to want. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I meant what I said, every word." "I know," Aliyah said. "I believe you." For the first time since her wedding day, she felt certain, not hopeful, not patient, but certain that the man she'd fallen for at first sight had finally truly become the man she'd always believed he could be.
But even as one wall came down that night, another threat was closing in from outside it. Min-jun's phone buzzed at 3 a.m. with a message that made his blood run cold, a warning delivered anonymously that named Aliyah directly for the first time. Tell Kang Tae-hyun his weakness has a name now. Protect her carefully. She won't be safe for long. Somewhere in the city, the Choi Syndicate had stopped watching and started planning, and the peace Tae-hyun and Aliyah had just found together was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. By morning, the mansion had transformed into something closer to a fortress. Min-jun briefed Tae-hyun at dawn, laying out the full scope of the threat with the calm precision of a man who'd spent the night preparing for exactly this moment. Additional security teams had been deployed. Every entry point to the estate now carried double coverage. The message from the Choi Syndicate had been traced to a burner line, untraceable but unmistakably deliberate. They want a reaction, something that makes you vulnerable enough to exploit. If you retaliate recklessly, you play directly into whatever they're planning. And if I do nothing, then they escalate until you're forced to respond anyway. Either way, they've backed you into a corner. Tae-hyun stared at the message displayed on Min-jun's tablet, the words, "His weakness has a name now," settling into him with a coldness that had nothing to do with fear for himself and everything to do with fear for her. "Get me a meeting with Choi Dae-ho, directly, no intermediaries." Min-jun's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, that's—" "I know what it is. Set it up." When Aliyah learned of the plan later that morning, her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "Absolutely not. Aliyah, you are not walking into a meeting with the man threatening my life like this is a business negotiation." "It is a business negotiation," Tae-hyun said calmly. "Everything in my world eventually comes down to one. The Chois don't want war any more than I do. War is expensive, unpredictable, and bad for everyone's interests. What they want is leverage. I intend to remove that leverage before it becomes a problem neither of us can walk back from. By offering yourself as a target, by showing them exactly how costly targeting you would be." His voice was steady, but something in his eyes carried a weight she recognized now. Not recklessness, but the calculated resolve of a man who had spent his whole life protecting the people under his care, even at cost to himself. "I won't let anything happen to you, Aliyah. I need you to trust me on this." She studied him for a long moment, torn between fear and the deep, unshakable knowledge that this man, however imperfect, however guarded he'd once been, had never once given her a reason to doubt his word since the night everything between them changed. "If you're doing this," she finally said, "I want to know everything. No more protecting me from information, not anymore." Tae-hyun nodded slowly, something like respect passing behind his eyes. "Agreed." 3 days later, the meeting took place in neutral territory, a private dining room in one of Seoul's oldest hotels, chosen specifically for its reputation as sacred ground among the city's rival organizations, a place where violence had never once been permitted to unfold. Choi Dae-ho arrived precisely on time, flanked by 2 of his own men, his expression carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd built an empire on never showing his hand too early. "Kang Tae-hyun," he said, settling into the seat across the table. "I confess I didn't expect you to request this meeting personally." "I find it saves time cutting out the theater," Tae-hyun replied evenly. "Let's discuss the message your organization sent regarding my wife." Something flickered across Choi's expression, brief surprise, quickly masked. "I'm not certain what you're referring to." "I think you understand exactly what I'm referring to. The two men studied each other across the table, decades of careful rivalry compressed into a single, tense silence. Territory disputes are one thing, Tae-hyun continued. Business is business. But if your organization has decided to target my family directly, I want you to understand precisely what that decision will cost you. Is that a threat, Kang? It's a fact. My father built alliances across 3 continents that I've spent the last 5 years quietly expanding. If anything happens to my wife, every one of those alliances turns against your organization simultaneously. You won't be fighting one enemy, you'll be fighting all of them, and you won't survive the year. The silence that followed carried real weight now, Choi's careful composure cracking just slightly at the edges. I have no interest in a war that costs me everything for nothing gained, Tae-hyun said, his voice dropping into something almost conversational, almost reasonable. Neither, I suspect, do you. So let's discuss what you actually want and find a solution that doesn't require either of us losing what we can't afford to lose. The negotiation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, details Tae-hyun would later summarize for Aliyah in careful, patient explanation. Territorial boundaries redrawn, certain shipping routes ceded in exchange for others, a formal agreement that neither family's personal members would ever again become targets in a business dispute. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Rivalries this old rarely disappeared entirely, but it was enough. Enough to remove the immediate threat, enough to buy the kind of peace that let people build lives instead of merely surviving them. When Tae-hyun finally returned home that evening, Aliyah was waiting in the entryway, having refused to go to bed until she knew he was safe. "It's done," he said simply. "You're safe. We're safe." Aliyah crossed the distance between them without a word and wrapped her arms around him, holding on with a fierceness that spoke louder than anything she could have said. "I was so afraid," she admitted into his shoulder. "I know. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you more before it was resolved. You told me exactly as much as I asked for. That's all I needed." In the weeks that followed, something fundamental shifted in how Tae-hyun moved through his own world, not in dramatic, sweeping gestures, but in small, consistent choices that added up to something larger than either of them had anticipated. He began bringing Aliyah to functions he'd previously attended alone, introducing her not as an obligation fulfilled, but as his wife, spoken with a warmth that made his own associates take notice. He canceled meetings when she needed him, something unthinkable in the man he'd been a year prior. He learned slowly and imperfectly to say the things he felt instead of burying them beneath careful silence. At a formal gathering hosted by one of his oldest business partners, an older woman, a widow, who had known Tae-hyun's mother decades earlier, pulled Aliyah aside during the reception. "You've changed him," the woman said, studying Aliyah with quiet appraisal. "I don't think I changed him," Aliyah replied honestly. "I think he just finally let himself be who he already was." The woman smiled, something knowing in her expression. His mother would have said the same thing. She always believed there was warmth in that boy, buried under everything his father tried to teach him. I'm glad someone finally found it. One evening, several weeks after the meeting with Choi Dae-ho, Tae-hyun asked Aliyah to join him in the garden, the same stone bench where he'd first told her about the surveillance, though the mood tonight carried none of that earlier tension. "I've been thinking about my mother a great deal lately," he said, settling beside her as the last of the daylight faded into evening. "What about her?" about the promise I made her the night before she died. I told her I would remember what she said. For years I thought remembering was enough, but I understand now that remembering isn't the same as living it." He turned to face her fully, something deliberate and unguarded in his expression. "I want to live it, Aliyah, not just with you privately, in stolen moments in my study at midnight. I want everyone to know exactly what you mean to me. I want to be the kind of husband my mother believed I could become, not the one my father tried to make me." "You already are," Aliyah said softly. "I want to be more. I want to build something with you that looks nothing like the marriage I grew up watching. I don't have all the answers for how to do that, but I know I want to try every day for as long as you'll let me." Aliyah felt tears gathering, warm and unguarded, as she reached for his hands. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight. You just have to keep choosing this, choosing us." "I choose you," he said, the words carrying none of the difficulty they once had, spoken now with the ease of a man who had finally made peace with wanting something openly. "I choose you today, and I'll choose you tomorrow, and every day after that, for as long as I'm fortunate enough to have you." The space between them closed slowly, both of them fully present in the moment, no lingering fear, no unresolved threat hanging over their heads, just two people who had fought their way to something real. When their lips met this time, it carried none of the frantic uncertainty of the karaoke lounge, none of the raw vulnerability of the confession in his study. This kiss was steady, sure, the quiet confirmation of two people who had chosen each other fully, with open eyes and open hearts, exactly as his mother had once hoped he'd someday learn to do. "I love you," Aliyah whispered against his lips. "I love you," he echoed, and for the first time in his life, the words came without hesitation, without the weight of 26 years of silence pressing against them. Months later, on the anniversary of their wedding, Aliyah found Tae-hyun standing in the garden at dawn, a small bouquet of flowers in his hand, the same variety, she would later learn, that had grown in his mother's favorite corner of his childhood home. "What are those for?" she asked, joining him. "I visit her grave every year on this day," he said quietly. "I used to go alone, and I'd stand there feeling like I was failing to keep the promise I made her. This year, I wanted you to come with me. I wanted her to know I finally understood what she was trying to teach me." They stood together at his mother's grave that morning, and Tae-hyun spoke softly, telling her everything, about Aliyah, about the marriage he'd once feared would become the same hollow arrangement his parents had endured, about the walls that had finally truly come down. "You were right," he said quietly, laying the flowers at the base of the headstone. "Love isn't a weakness. It's the bravest thing I've ever done." Aliyah slipped her hand into his, and together they stood in the quiet morning light, two people who had built something real out of an arrangement neither had chosen, but both had come to cherish beyond anything they'd ever expected. Because sometimes, the story reflects, love doesn't arrive the way we imagine it will, sweeping, immediate, effortless. Sometimes it arrives slowly, built one honest choice at a time by two people willing to tear down the walls their pasts built around them. And sometimes the marriage no one chose becomes the love story no one saw coming. If you were in Aliyah's position, would you have waited 3 years for Tae-hyun to open up, or walked away long before that karaoke night ever happened? Let us know your answer below, and if this story moved you, you know exactly what to do to catch the next one the moment it drops.